Joining us for today's session, Social Media Accessibility. Today's speaker is Gian Wild. Gian is the CEO of AccessibilityOz. She has worked in accessibility for over 20 years, and her achievements include the very first Australian accessible website and the accessibility compliance of the Melbourne 2006 and the 2018 Gold Coast Commonwealth Games. She is an active member of the W3C WCAG Working Group and has presented at the United Nations and at conferences all over the world. We are delighted to have Gian with us as today's speaker, and I will turn things over to you.
Thanks, Kevin. Thank you for joining me this morning. I'm actually in Australia, so it's really early morning for me. It's 1 a.m. And hopefully you can all understand my accent. And if not, that's what the captioner is for. difficult accents as well as people who are deaf and hard of hearing. So today I'm going to talk about social media and accessibility. And for those that can access the chat, I just want to get a +1 or a plus if you know who these two men are. So there's a couple of guys sitting in front of a Chevy Impala. Anyone know who they... I'm glad that my accent is beautiful. Yes. Okay, Jennifer Dunlap knows who these people are, and Kevin Hauer. So these guys are Sam and Dean Winchester. They're brothers, and they're the stars of a TV show, a sci-fi TV show called Supernatural. And Supernatural has basically taken over social media. So there'll be some references, quite a few references to Supernatural in this presentation. In fact, I did a lot of watching of Supernatural to actually prepare for this presentation. So that's, of course, very important. TV, very important. So basically, I've actually just come back from about 2 months travelling around US and Europe, speaking at conferences about mobile accessibility and social media accessibility and things like that. And at the beginning of February, I dislocated 2 of my toes in a car accident. And so this is basically what Hollywood would have you believe happens when you dislocate something like a shoulder or a foot or whatever. You just sort of pop it back in, you look a bit sad for a couple of hours, and, you know, then everything's fine. Well, in reality, dislocations are often actually worse than breaks. And this character, this guy, Jared Padalecki, who plays Sam Winchester, he dislocated his shoulder. And he actually had to play a number of the episodes with his shoulder in a sling, and he was actually in a sling for months. But of course on the TV show, they didn't say that he had dislocated his shoulder. They said that he had broken his collarbone because dislocations aren't, you know, sexy enough or something like that. But the reason that I realised that he had dislocated his shoulder and not broken his collarbone was through social media. And that made me feel a lot better because I've spent the last 2 months travelling and having to get wheelchairs everywhere because I still can't walk. So that's just one instance of where social media really does affect people and how they feel about themselves. So this is my staff. We all met for CSUN. There's a few of us missing. And basically, when I started AccessibilityOz in 2011, I wanted to support people with disabilities by hiring them, as well as providing, you know, accessible testing and websites and things like that. But if you look at us, we all look able-bodied. There's no one with a guide dog or, you know, a cane or in a wheelchair. And so the one thing to remember about accessibility is that it's people with disabilities often hidden in plain sight. So basically, we actually have 60% of my staff have significant disabilities that affect their daily life, and yet we all look fairly quote-unquote normal. We have people with dyslexia, moderate vision impairment, severe vision impairment, epilepsy, migraines, physical impairment, fibromyalgia, multiple sclerosis, Crohn's disease, PTSD, and Asperger's. And just a little bit about me. So I suppose why you should listen to me is I've been working in accessibility for 20 years, and I founded AccessibilityOz in 2011 and also spoke at the United Nations on the importance of web accessibility. We have locations in Australia, the United States and Europe, and we have a series of products and resources which I won't bother going through, other than to say that we have a website called a11yvoices.com, which is a series of blog posts written by people with disabilities about their accessibility experiences, and we're always looking for bloggers. So if anyone would like to contribute, we pay our bloggers, and we have a series of free information, including accessibility fact sheets, a series of videos called the CCC videos for developers, and an accessible slideshow which is available under Creative Commons. So let's talk about social media. What is social media? So this is social media explained according to a donut store. The tool that I have created, Purnima, we have 3 products: OzArt, which is an automated accessibility testing tool; OzPlayer, which is an accessible video player; and OzWiki, which is our database of accessibility errors, screenshots, code and solutions. And we're happy to give any attendees of my presentation, so that includes anyone attending today, free access to OzWiki for 6 months. So if you want to contact Kevin afterwards and pass along your email address, we'll give you access. So this is social media explained according to a donut store. Twitter, I'm eating a donut. Facebook, I like donuts. Foursquare, this is where I eat donuts. Instagram, here is a photo of my donut. YouTube, here I am eating a donut. LinkedIn, my skills include donut eating. Pinterest, here's a donut recipe. Spotify, now listening to the song Donuts. And G+, may it rest in peace, I'm a Google employee who eats donuts. And of course, one of course is missing is Tumblr, and this is kind of the kind of big joke on social media, is that everything in Tumblr is related to Supernatural. And so the explanation for Tumblr is, here's a picture of a donut, read blogs with a GIF that somehow pertains to Supernatural. And if you want to get a laugh, basically Google anything about...
Yeah, you can send them here. I'll give you a link to actually link directly to it instead of the stupid things that they have us do.
Whoever is speaking now, I'm going to go ahead and do a mute all command. Gian, you'll have to unmute yourself afterwards. We had some people come in after I muted.
Yep. Excellent. I'm back.
You are back.
Okay, so why is social media so important for people with disabilities? There are almost 3.4 billion active social media users, and on average people have 5.54 social media accounts. The average time spent on social media is almost 2 hours per day, and 91% of retail brands use 2 or more social media channels, and 81% of all small and medium businesses use social media. 81% of teenagers felt that they were more connected to their friends due to social media. 69% of them believed that it helps them interact with a more diverse group of people. And 68% feel as if they have people on social media that will support them in tough times. And in terms of the percentage of people of each age group that uses social media, it's not just young people. Find that about 36% of people 65 and older use social media. 64% of people 50 to 64 use social media. 78% of people aged 30 to 49 use social media, and of course 88% of people 18 to 29 use social media. And in terms of the people that use social media, the percentage of people of what they actually use ranges from WhatsApp to at about 22%, right up to YouTube, which is at 73%. And so the big ones, of course, are Facebook and YouTube. Facebook at 68%, and you know, the lowest at WhatsApp at 22%. But the thing to take into account here is that one social media does not network doesn't represent everyone. So you can't send content out to one social media network and think that you're going to get everyone. You have to spread it across different social media, because people choose social media that's best for them. The other thing is when it comes to people with disabilities, the unemployment for people with disabilities is at a very conservative estimate, about 10.2%. The percentage of recruiters who use LinkedIn is about 95%, and the percentage of HR managers that have reconsidered hiring a candidate after looking at social media is 55%. And so if you think about it, Jennifer Assumption has spent a lot of time making LinkedIn accessible, but if LinkedIn didn't have that person in that role, then, you know, LinkedIn would not be particularly accessible. And so someone going for, you know, a job in, say, the accessibility industry might be restricted because, A, they don't find out about jobs through LinkedIn, or, you know, when the recruitment person is looking at LinkedIn, they can't find their details and think, well, maybe they don't know, you know, what they're doing. So these statistics are all United States statistics. So just some examples of how social media changes people's lives. Twitter. So basically one of my staff members about 6-7 years ago, he is an expert screen reader user, did the screen reader testing for the Kindle app, etc. And he is originally Polish and wanted to move back to Poland. And back then when he did that, there wasn't a whole lot of remote work happening. And so it was through Twitter that he found out that AccessibilityOz was looking for an accessibility tester and that we were happy to hire remote workers. And so he got in contact with us through LinkedIn, and you know, he's one of our full-time employees here, and he actually did the screen reader testing for the social media accessibility for the last 3 years. So LinkedIn, an example also about AccessibilityOz is we've been looking for a US salesperson for about a year, and we you know, went through the hiring process and couldn't find someone. And Thanksgiving Day, I was in Colorado just after accessing higher ground, and I thought, you know what, I'm just going to sit here and I'm just going to send actual messages to everyone in my network that has the word sales in their history. And so I just sat there and copy and paste and sent, you know, 500 emails. And someone contacted me and said, hey, you know, I'm interested. I remember meeting you a couple of years ago. You know, I saw that you sent this on Thanksgiving. Are you happy to have a call right now? And so I said, yes. And we ended up talking on for 2 or 3 hours. And we hired him late December, and you know, he's been our salesperson for the last four months. So once again, another indication of how social media can change lives. So, you know, Facebook, I mean, I love Australia. I do call Australia home, but there are some problems with Australia. We're a small country. We're a large geographical country, but there's a small number of people. We often don't have access to the same information or the same kind of medical advances that a larger country like the US has. So I know someone who has a rare disease and has been told by her doctors that there was basically nothing that was available, there was nothing that she could do. And she joined a Facebook group that was, you know, that put people in touch with other people that had this rare disease, and she found out that there was a particular use of a medication that could help her, and it was an off-label use, so that's why people in Australia didn't know about it, but she was able to take that information, do a bit of research, take it to her doctor, and get that medication in Australia. And Twitter. So about probably 2 years ago, Graham Innes, who was our Disability Discrimination Commissioner in Australia, got knocked back from using an Uber because he had a guide dog. He's vision impaired, so that wasn't a good look. And so that's something that, you know, made newspapers and things like that. And, you know, the accessibility of systems like Uber and Lyft have been a little bit slow to kind of, you know, be accessible. And in San Francisco, there was actually a vision impaired person who was finding the Lyft app, you know, very difficult to use. And of course, these systems, they might make things a lot easier for the general public, but they can basically mean the opportunity to leave the house or not leave the house for people with disabilities, because they can come to a certain location, you can communicate with your driver, etc., etc. You don't have to look out for an actual taxi cab or things like that. So this vision impaired person tweeted at Lyft and said, hey, I can't use your system, and they invited him to come into the office in San Francisco and explain, the issues that he was having, and they addressed those issues, and he met with them, for a couple of months now and again, and eventually they ended up hiring him as the accessibility specialist for Lyft. And YouTube. So there's a story about how YouTube saved my life, which is about a guy who was watching funny YouTube videos while eating a steak, and he started choking. And he, knew that he couldn't do the Heimlich maneuver. He was by himself, and so he actually searched on YouTube how to stop yourself from choking if you were by yourself, and basically you bend yourself over a chair and kind of push your stomach in, and basically it stopped him choking. So, these are all examples of how social media has changed people's lives. And although they might not have to do with people with disabilities, it is an indication that social media is something that is important and valuable in our society. And so although people might think social media is fluffy, it's something that really does affect everyone, and so people with disabilities should have the right to access this content just like everybody else. So the main reasons behind social media social media use is things like personal, so creating online commentary of personal thoughts, sharing photos and discussing social events. I personally didn't find Instagram particularly useful until I started travelling, and then it was a way that I could share, with my friends, where I was and the kind of things that I was doing, because I do travel the world and it does sound exotic and it is a bit of an Instagram life, but it's also a way for me to record where it is that I go and what it is that I see. Then there's work, so things like creating a resume, creating professional connections, discussing job opportunities. So LinkedIn, for example, once again, I have a lot of connections on LinkedIn, but I didn't find it particularly useful, and often if you message me in LinkedIn, I won't notice for a month or two, but I'm using it more and more because this is the way that I keep up with my colleagues writing articles. So especially Sherry Bernhaber writes a lot of articles on Medium about accessibility and just got awarded their most prominent diversity author, and that's how I keep up to date with what she's writing, because she posts on LinkedIn. Entertainment. So things like sharing videos, following discussions from celebrities, discussing strategies in online games. So in my research for this presentation, I did a whole lot of Supernatural watching, and I found that there's a whole section, or there's a whole, I think all of Tumblr, that talks about Supernatural, and there's even people that will actually write, meta-analysis of an episode after it's released. So you can kind of, look into, if you're really interested in a particular show, you can kind of see what has been referenced and, things that were referenced 10 seasons ago, et cetera, and it's a way for other people to connect with people, especially if they're in remote locations. There's also provision of goods and services, such as sharing information about a product, responding to user feedback about a product, and accessing government services. So, Australia, we're known for our hot summer days, and there was a day that I flew from Canberra to Sydney in this tiny little aeroplane, and basically it was so small that we basically got off the plane, deplaned onto the tarmac, and it was 38 degrees, which is about 107 degrees Fahrenheit, I think, maybe 110 degrees Fahrenheit, and it was middle of the day, so the sun was, burning down on us, and we were standing on the tarmac, and there was a door that went into the terminal about 100 feet away, and so we went towards it, and we were stopped, and we were told, no, you're not allowed to go through that door. That's you know, you're not authorised. We have to wait for them to open this other door. And so we stood there and we waited and we waited, and, you know, I'm thinking I'm going to miss my meeting, I'm going to get sunburnt. You know, there's basically standing on this tarmac, and about 30 minutes later, I decided to tweet at Virgin Australia, because it was a Virgin Australia flight, and I said something along the lines of, you know, don't understand why we're standing on the tarmac when there's an open door, you know, 50 metres away. And although Virgin Australia did not respond, within about 5 minutes, someone came out that door and ushered us into the terminal. So, you know, was that because of social media? Who knows? But, you know, that kind of talking to product owners and stuff is something that we haven't seen in a long time. And that kind of responsiveness is something that people are starting to take for granted. And education. So things like participation in online classes, sharing learning resources, and it's not just about higher education. It could be, you know, what happened a week or so ago. My coffee machine stopped working. It gave me this error that I'd never seen before. So I basically searched for the error and I watched a YouTube video on how to reset my coffee machine. So once again, it's a way of, you know, educating people. And I wouldn't have been able to find a manual for a coffee machine that I bought, you know, 10 years ago. So why isn't social media accessible? So basically there are a couple of reasons why social media is not accessible. The first is this example here, which is where Facebook in the heading has code. And it says basically the Facebook heading is span class equals quo, end span, why sacrifice yourself, whistleblowers. And so for some reason Facebook changed something and all of a sudden code was showing up in the headings where it hadn't shown up before. And Facebook changes a lot, up to about 5 times a day. And so, you know, it means that, you know, basically even if everything was perfectly accessible then today, then it might not be perfectly accessible tomorrow. It's something that, you know, accessibility is something that you don't do accidentally, and until these systems have a dedicated accessibility testing process, then, you know, they're not going to meet accessibility requirements. And if they actually do fix something, then, you know, they can easily break it the next day. So the next example I have here is from YouTube, and so this is the social media testing I did last year around CSUN, and basically there's a little vertical ellipsis underneath the video that if you activate gives you some options about whether you're interested or whether you want to watch later and things like that. Now with the keyboard, if you activate the vertical ellipsis, the tab takes you to the first option, not interested, and then the next tab takes you to the address bar in the browser. So you basically can't access the other options, and, you know, basically breaks the keyboard accessibility of the site. Now that was, I don't know how long that error existed, but it wasn't very long, because about a month later I tested it and that error was gone. LinkedIn, so 2017, in a post, we had this little settings button, and 2017 we found that it was unlabeled. 2018 we found that it was labeled as button IP24DP button, and then 2019 we find that the button's replaced entirely and has an accurate label. So that's the thing to remember about social media is, you know, if anyone says, hey, it's accessible, you need to say, well, you know, that when was the last time it was tested, and what kind of processes do these systems have in place. So to the social media testing that we conducted, basically we tested a standard user journey, so registering for the first time, logging in, reading an item or a tweet or watching a video or something like that, submitting an item, and also, you know, adding any accessibility features. The user functionality that we focused on was keyboard only, increased text size, and using a screen reader. We originally in 2016, 17 and 18, we tested Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube and Twitter, and this year for the first time we've also tested Instagram and Pinterest. So just a note that this is not a complete audit. There may be many other accessibility problems. What we tried to do is focus on the absolutely most serious issues. I'm going to stop for a moment and ask if anyone has any questions so far.
So as we mentioned before, those of you with access to the chat, please put your questions in the chat. We had a couple of questions come in during the presentation so far, and I believe Gian already answered those. So please keep your questions coming. Those of you who are connected over the phone, and if you'd like to ask verbally, you can press the pound or the hash button and the number 6. That will unmute your line. I'll get a little notification when you do that and be able to see that, and I'll give you a chance to ask your question. So please go ahead and do that now, and those of you with other questions, please enter them in the chat.
Oh, sure.
Lori,
I will repeat that info. So yes, there are 6: Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, and Pinterest.
all right, we have a few other users typing. We'll give you a chance to finish that. Purnima asks, as we talk about YouTube, the video plays main role. Until today, the audio description is not enabled in YouTube videos. It looks like Purnima's adding that.
Yeah, basically any reason or timeline plan to enable this audio descriptions option. I would love to give you a timeline or a reason, but you'd need to talk to Google about that. I think audio descriptions are really important. They're just as important for people who are vision impaired as people, who are hearing impaired who rely on captions. So the fact that audio descriptions are not supported well by video players and YouTube is very problematic, and I wish that, they address that.
And then Lori asks, on Facebook and Instagram, was it just posts that were tested for A11Y, or did you also test stories?
Yes, it was just posts. Okay, I'll get going. So, common accessibility issues. Although this is not the most serious issue, keyboard accessibility, I'm going to start with this because it plays an important role in the most serious accessibility issue, which is autoplay. So these are our results. Basically, everything except for Pinterest did not contain a keyboard trap. So Pinterest with a keyboard trap is very, very problematic. We found that Pinterest and Twitter had significant items that were not accessible to a keyboard. Now, we passed Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube because we said the major items were accessible to the keyboard. But we still found things like emojis and, posting images and things like that sometimes were not fully accessible to the keyboard. We also found that in all of them except for Facebook, the social media networks have this same view, which is basically you have the header, your left-hand column, your center column, and the right column, except for Pinterest, which didn't have that layout. And because of the use of infinite scrolling, which occurs across all social media networks, the only one in which the right-hand column could be accessed by the keyboard was Facebook. So Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, YouTube, you could not access any content that was in the right-hand column if you were using the keyboard. In terms of the keyboard focus indicator, once again, we were looking at whether the keyboard focus indicator had a higher contrast, and we were also looking at just the main items. So there was certainly a number of items across all systems that didn't have keyboard focus indicators, but both Pinterest and Twitter, the main items did not have a valid keyboard focus indicator. And keyboard focus order is basically the order, making sure that the order that items receive focus is the same as the visual order, which is really important because people use the keyboard in addition to, viewing the page. And we found that Instagram and YouTube did not have an accurate keyboard focus order. And however, YouTube was a little bit different because the reason why they didn't have a accessible keyboard focus order is because when you first go to a video, you land immediately on the play pause button, which is what they've done to address the autoplay issue. But it does mean the content before that is not easily accessible to the keyboard. So this is the keyboard trap we found on Pinterest. So when we first created a feed, there's an option here that says more ideas for your board photography, and there's an explore button. And basically that explore button contained a keyboard trap. Keyboard focus order. The keyboard focus order starts on the first story and who that's by. This one's by ABC News. And so the content prior to that, which is the Instagram link, the search, your notifications, your likes, your profile, is not accessible to the keyboard. It actually occurs at the very end of the page, but because of the infinite scrolling, a keyboard user won't ever get that. And that, by the way, is a quokka, which is an Australian animal. So this keyboard focus order failed Instagram, YouTube, and YouTube. And Twitter, the right-hand column was not accessible to the keyboard. So, basically it tabs through the left-hand column, your AccessibilityOz info, the tweet, following, trends for you. You can add a tweet. You start tabbing through all the tweets, and because of infinite scrolling, you never get to that right-hand column, which has who to follow, live videos, etc., etc. And that occurred on Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. Now, Facebook has dealt with this. They have exactly the same thing, which is where you tab through the header, then you tab through the left column, and you tab through the center column, and you have infinite scrolling, so you can never get to the right-hand column. But they have addressed that by adding skip links, so at the top of their page, which allows you to jump to various different sections. So what you're showing here is that you can jump to the reminders, trending topics and more, and if you activate that, you'll go straight to that right-hand column. And they've done that really nicely. So when you're tabbing through and you've actually selected a particular option, it highlights it on the page so you know exactly where it is that you're going to. Okay, so autoplay. This is one of the non-interference clauses of WCAG 2. Basically, there's a whole series, there's 4 non-interference clauses, which if you don't meet these requirements, then it makes the entire site inaccessible to users. WCAG 2 allows that you can have sections of your website that is not accessible. However, those sections that are not accessible and not compliant to WCAG 2 must always meet the 4 non-interference clauses. So hopefully the captioner picked that up. That's it. Excellent. So this is by far the most serious accessibility issue that we see in the networks. And basically on default viewing, so basically the first time you view a system before you make any changes to the settings, every single one autoplays videos on default except for Instagram. And on iOS, all of them autoplay on default. And why that's important is because not everyone is an expert screen reader user or an expert internet user, and they basically won't even think to look at a settings to try and turn this feature off. So although there may be features, functions to turn these autoplay settings off, they might be hard to find, and you'll find that a lot of users won't even go looking for them. And then the next thing that's important here is, can the video actually be paused? and it needs to be able to be paused by 3 different methods: the mouse, the keyboard, and touch. And we tested only on iOS. So although Facebook has autoplay, it can be paused by all 3 methods. Instagram can be paused by the mouse and the keyboard, but cannot be paused by touch. LinkedIn can be paused by all 3 methods. Pinterest cannot be paused by any method whatsoever. Twitter can be paused by the mouse and touch, but cannot be paused by the keyboard. And YouTube can be paused by all 3 methods. So basically, the combination of autoplay on default with the video not being able to be paused with the keyboard on Pinterest and Twitter means that those systems violate one of the WCAG 2 non-interference clauses. And so this is what we see here. We've got a Twitter item, and basically the keyboard just skips over the item entirely, and so you can't actually play that, pause that when you need to. And then the ability to turn off autoplay is really important. Facebook, you can do that on desktop and iOS. Instagram, it's not applicable for desktop because it doesn't autoplay by default, but you can't turn it off on iOS when it does autoplay on default. LinkedIn, you can turn it off on both desktop and iOS. Pinterest, you can't turn it off at all. Twitter, you can turn it off on both desktop and iOS. And YouTube, you can't turn it off in settings. Now, just a little bit about YouTube. Yes, you can actually turn off the autoplay when you're playing a video, but it does have a bit of a problem, and so let's have a look at that. So this is what happens when you want to turn off when you look at a video. Basically, the first keyboard focus indicator goes to the pause, which is great, and if you want to turn off the autoplay, you actually have to get to the right-hand column. But because of the infinite scrolling, if you're watching a video that has a lot of comments, you can't ever get to the right-hand column because it keeps loading comments and keeps loading comments and keeps loading comments. Also, that autoplay feature, it looks like a little slider, is not coded very well, and I'll talk about ARIA and HTML later on, and it's actually quite difficult to activate using various different assistive technologies. And the other thing is that this autoplay refers to just automatically playing a video after another video has played, not auto-playing a video when you first go to the video page. And in addition to that, if you turn autoplay off, then you have an ad and then you watch the video. Let me start again, actually. If you have autoplay on, then what happens is you have an ad, you watch the video, and then another video plays, and then another video plays, and then another video plays. If you turn autoplay off, then what actually ends up happening is you have an ad, the video plays, and then it plays 2 more ads before it stops entirely. So that's not really fair, that someone who turns off autoplay has to actually go through more ads to get to the point where they stop. Any questions on autoplay and keyboard?
All right, just a reminder, excuse me, losing my voice. Just a reminder, you can put your questions in the chat or unmute your phone line with the pound or hash button and the number 6. I'll give you a chance to do that now. All right, I'm not seeing anyone typing questions, and I don't see anyone going off of mute, so go ahead.
Okay, let's talk about page titles and headings. Now, page titles and headings are really important because they're used a lot by screen reader users, but they also convey a kind of overview of a page. If you think about a website, you're not seeing just unlimited text. It's broken up in certain ways. Page titles are also important, especially for search results and things like that. So the accessibility of page titles and headings is really important. So what we found is when it came to page titles, LinkedIn and Pinterest did not have unique and descriptive page titles. So we found that, LinkedIn was basically their page title for all their pages that we looked at was just LinkedIn. And the same for Pinterest. Their page titles were all Pinterest. And a reference to the site is really important as well. It's a way that screen reader users can navigate and orient themselves to determine if they're leaving a site or something like that. And on Facebook, it did have a reference to the site in most cases, except on the home page or your profile page, where it just had your name as opposed to your name - Facebook. So here this is LinkedIn as the page title on home, and this on home is 2, which means you've got 2 messages, LinkedIn, and then the page title on messaging is just LinkedIn. And then the Facebook, this is my Facebook, and it's just called Gian Wild. So headings. So there are a number of things that we looked at in headings. Basically, whether headings were properly nested. Now, a lot of people argue as to whether this is actually an important WCAG 2 requirement, and in some cases perhaps it's not, but it is a good indication as to whether accessibility has been considered, and we found that none of the systems actually had properly nested headings. We found that 4 systems, LinkedIn, Pinterest, Twitter and YouTube, coded content as headings, which is really confusing to a screen reader user because they're getting a whole lot of information that's not relevant to them when they pull everything out by headings. We found that only 2 systems, LinkedIn and YouTube, had their headings properly coded with H1, H2 and H3. Now, Facebook did have span role equals heading, and I'm sure there's a reason that they didn't use H1, H2, H3, but it probably isn't a very good reason. We found that there was only one network, which is Facebook, that had pages start with an H1. And yes, in some cases it's valid to not have pages start with an H1. However, we found when we looked at the heading hierarchy, there was just absolutely no way that it had been done properly. And we found that all pages had at least one appropriate heading except for Pinterest. So here, this is an example of YouTube with content coded as a heading. And so you see the entire help text is coded as a heading because you've got a little help icon after the heading. So you hear the thumbnails, and then you hear choose the thumbnail that best represents your video. To be able to add custom thumbnails, your account needs to be verified and in good standing. Learn more. And so that's a lot of additional information that screen reader users will hear. And this occurs, content coded as a heading, occurs on LinkedIn, Pinterest, Twitter, and YouTube. And so Pinterest, we found that this heading here, more like this, was coded with a div class and not as a heading. And this occurred on Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, Twitter, and YouTube. And Pinterest, we found some pages, this is the main profile page, the main page didn't have any appropriate headings. The only headings were sections under this little plus and question mark sign, which occur in the bottom right-hand corner, around adding a browser button. So it wasn't valid in terms of what is actually on that page at all. And that only occurred on Pinterest. So inaccessible forms. Now, all these social media networks are about sharing content, and so basically it's about having accessible ways to share that content, and so that means forms and fields and user-generated information. So what we found is that every single social media network had fields that were not coded with label for an ID. In some cases they were coded with ARIA described by or ARIA label, but none of them were coded with, there were fields in every single social media network that were not coded with label for an ID. We found that there was field sets missing legends in everything except for Instagram and LinkedIn. We found that there were orphaned or multiple field labels in LinkedIn, Pinterest and YouTube, and we found that radio buttons and checkboxes didn't have the same name in Twitter, and that's really important when it comes to making sure things are coded and therefore can be interpreted by assistive technologies. So this is an example. This is registering a new account with Facebook, and basically all the fields that you use to register an account are not coded label for an ID. And this occurred on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Pinterest, Twitter, and YouTube. Any questions so far? Yes, Dennis, the headings and form labels are very bad.
We did have one person unmute their line, so now would be a good chance to ask your question. It is a 410 phone number. I think it was unmuted by accident. Okay. There are a few folks typing, so we'll give them a chance to finish that up. Okay. Purnima asks, just curious if these social media sites are sticking to WCAG 2.0 standards or upgraded to 2.1, or do they have a different set of guidelines that to follow?
So, I mean, they can't even meet WCAG 2. So I think WCAG 2.1 is a little bit beyond their capabilities at the moment. But there is something that in 2.1 because I haven't checked it lately, there was an increased text size to 400%, which I think made it to the final 2.1 list of changes to text size. Let me just, oh no, it still says 400%. Sorry, it still says 200%. What I did find a few years ago is that if you increase text size on YouTube to 200%, you would actually lose the upload and notifications button in the top right-hand corner because they assumed that you were viewing it on a mobile and that you'd have a mobile app to upload your videos. And so, of course, that's not the case if someone's using increased text size because they've got a vision impairment. And what I did find is that they actually increased that so that it disappeared when you hit 400% instead of 200%. So they are doing some things, and I think it probably has to do more with, you know, what the general public are using or doing, as opposed to whether they're thinking about it being WCAG 2 or WCAG 2.1.
Then Lori asks, Gian, you may address this later, but curious about your involvement with each of the platforms around A11Y as to what improvements they are working on making. Feels like this topic is a moving target. For example, several platforms now support alt text.
Yeah, and this is something that, thank you, Dennis, for pointing out that 400%. It's under reflow, it's not under text resize. So it's 1.4.10 or 1.4.10 reflow. Yes, and thank you, Laurie. I've been doing this testing for three odd years now, and I would love to talk to the social media networks about my, my findings, but I have not found them particularly open to talking, with the exception of Jenison Assumption from LinkedIn. He is very active in the accessibility community in San Francisco. He runs the Bay Area Accessibility Meetup, and he really cares about accessibility, and he's done a lot to make LinkedIn accessible. And I actually was so impressed with how much he had managed to improve LinkedIn in my last social media testing about a year ago that I presented him with the award of the most improved social media network and the most accessible. So not fully accessible, but the most accessible out of all of them. So I haven't actually come up with, who wins the prize this time round, but, I was so impressed with how much he'd improved things. It was good to see. So, but yes, I would love to talk to these people about stuff. I do note that they do tend to fix the things that I pick up. So there has been, significant changes. If I highlight one thing one year, it tends to be fixed the next year. With the exception of infinite scrolling, I definitely picked that up last year and said it was a major issue, and that hasn't been addressed by any of the social media networks.
And then we had a few comments. Dennis posted the actual WCAG standard for reflow, which is 400%. And I think that's it. I think we can continue.
Excellent. So another thing is the incorrect use of ARIA and HTML. So these are things that they might seem, it's not that important, but once again, they are indications of, how correctly coded these items are and how much, they care about accessibility. And so what we found is that there was invalid ARIA in everything except for Instagram and Pinterest. Iframes were not accessible in all 6 social media networks. We found that JavaScript links were used in Facebook and YouTube. We found there were empty links in every system except for LinkedIn. And we found that there were missing mandatory attributes on everything except Instagram. So, these are not like the most, if you get one of these things wrong, it's not the end of the world. But this is a very good indication that, the code is really not up to scratch. And if the code is not up to scratch, then you can be sure that there'll be assistive technology problems. And so the last thing that I want to talk about in detail is screen reader accessibility. So things were a little bit different with screen reader accessibility, and I have on this call Rafael Shalampowitz, who did the screen reader testing. He's vision impaired and is an expert screen reader user. He used NVDA and JAWS on PC and VoiceOver on iOS. Now, Raf can look at the code and, he has someone who's not vision impaired that can help him through things. So these results are a little bit different, where a cross means that he could not complete something at all, and an exclamation mark means that he could do it, but it required a lot of effort on his part in terms of looking at the code or playing around, moving between different, features and things like that. So basically anything that is marked exclamation mark, you can guarantee that there will be users that cannot do it because they don't know their screen reader functions as well as Raf does, who, uses a screen reader 14, 16 hours a day for about 15 years. So I'm going to also talk about them network by network as opposed to across the items. So Facebook on desktop, we found that basically the register in some cases triggered a reCAPTCHA. Now reCAPTCHA is the Google CAPTCHA and it's not accessible. We do testing on it every couple of months when they release a new version, and Raf found that he could not complete the CAPTCHA even though it had an audio version. So that basically was a failure in that regard. The login, create post with accessibility features and read post with accessibility features for Facebook were all extremely difficult, either to add alt text or to navigate using headings because the headings were not very good on Facebook. In Instagram, Raf couldn't register at all. And he did find that he could log in once registered, couldn't create, with Instagram, the reason why he couldn't register is he got to a point where he put in details and then he got an error that said, sorry, something went wrong. And so that's a violation of one of the error requirements in WCAG 2 because it didn't provide a suggestion, didn't say, hey, this is what went wrong, this is what you need to fix, and he couldn't go any further. It was difficult for him to create a post with accessibility features or submit a post because often the next button could not be accessed with VoiceOver, but it was something that was not easily reproducible, so he wasn't sure exactly why that happened or when it would happen. In LinkedIn, the register field labels were the labels themselves. Although they were coded properly, the labels themselves were unclear. The login process was very good, and the creating a post with accessibility features was difficult for one reason only, which is that every time RAF entered a character in to add alt text, it would read the remaining characters left. So if you wanted to write AccessibilityOz logo, it would say A, 400 characters left, C, 399 characters left, C, 398 characters left. So quite annoying. Pinterest, it was difficult to edit the name because Pinterest allocates the name for you. The login process was accessible, could not create a post with accessibility features at all, and but could read a post with accessibility features. Twitter, the verification on desktop is very difficult, as well as choosing who to follow. Login was accessible. The alternative text add button was difficult to find. However, it also needed to be turned on in settings, so it's not available by default. And the lack of headings made actually reading posts in Twitter quite difficult. In terms of YouTube, the registration was very difficult because the phone number and date of birth fields were not accessible. Basically, logging in was okay, but creating a video was difficult because fields were not labelled at all, and there was RAF actually accidentally published a video. So kind of accidentally publishing something is kind of like a failure in my book. And of course, in terms of reading or accessing a video, there's no audio descriptions or transcripts. Does anyone have any questions about that so far? Then I'm going to go through the iOS results. I'll take that as a no. So the iOS results, we found, and I'll go through them in social media network again. So Facebook, the registration was almost impossible because the birthday fields were not accessible and couldn't find the accessibility features. Couldn't find the accessibility features on creating the post with alt. So apparently there is a way to add alt attributes to Facebook images now, but that wasn't something that a screen reader user could find. The login and reading a post went well on iOS. Instagram, basically RAF got the sorry something went wrong and he couldn't complete any further testing. So those are all marked not applicable. LinkedIn, register, login, create a post with accessibility features, read a post with accessibility features were all great. Pinterest, the register was not accessible because RAF couldn't select interests when he went through the registration process, and he couldn't share pins either. Twitter, register, login and create was accessible, and the reading a post was difficult because of the lack of headings. YouTube, we couldn't test the register on iOS because it was basically saying you can only create something linked to a Google account and therefore it would already be created. The sign-in elements field was very difficult. Creating posts was also, creating video was also very difficult. There are a number of unlabeled buttons, and it was not clear whether a video was actually being uploaded or not. And also reading a video, it's difficult because of the lack of audio descriptions and transcripts. So any questions about that? And I have Raf on the call if you have screen reader questions.
Just a reminder, you can unmute and ask verbally if you'd like. It's pound or hash button and the number 6 on your phone. I don't see anyone unmuting, but we do have Purnima typing again. We'll give her a chance. Looks like they stopped typing, so let's continue.
Okay, and the next thing I want to talk about is inconsistency. I found 4 types of inconsistency in between the mobile and desktop, and Purnima, I'll get Raf to answer that question later about Firefox or Chrome. So inconsistency about mobile and desktop. So it's really important that there is a level of consistency between mobile and desktop, because people are restricted to, they can be restricted to one device, or they're moving between them, and so they're actually used to one system and they want the next system, the same system, to operate correctly. Now this is one of the things that the BBC Mobile Accessibility Guidelines recommends, and also the Mobile Site Accessibility Testing Guidelines that we developed for the ICT Accessibility Testing Symposium also recommends. So if you're interested in mobile testing accessibility guidelines, you know, please let us know and we can share them with you. It was something that we did as a community and was released in October last year. So the first thing is inconsistency in visuals. So this here is Instagram, and on the iPhone you've got these 4 icons, which are 3 of those icons are exactly the same as on the desktop, and the third icon, which is the share icon, looks like kind of a diagonal arrow on the iPhone, and it looks like a kind of square with an arrow, a vertical arrow on the desktop. And basically that's something that, you know, you kind of expect it to behave the same and therefore look the same. They're both basically sharing options, so they do the same thing, and so it is important that they're consistent and they have consistent iconography. Default operation is also really important, and so we see this in Instagram as well. So in Instagram on the mobile, the videos play automatically, but on desktop they don't play automatically. So it's a small thing, but it just kind of jars the user a bit when they see something. They might not even realise it, but they see something that's different, and so that's why it's important to have consistency in default operation. We also see inconsistency in functionality. So this is Instagram again. This is the share button, the one that was different on both systems. And so the one for the mobile is basically an option to share amongst your Instagram friends. And the share on the desktop allows you to share to Facebook, Messenger, Twitter, email, and copy link. So, you know, you might be used to sharing to Twitter whenever you look at something on the desktop, and you kind of would expect to have that same functionality if you're looking at it on a phone. And inconsistency in settings. So this is Twitter. Now, Twitter on the mobile has a whole bunch of different accessibility settings. So they include Sorry, I'm just opening it up so I can see it properly. So basically, on the mobile, you've got the ability to pronounce the hash as hashtag, read shortened URLs, increase colour contrast, reduce motion, etc. And then on the desktop, you've only got two options, which is compose image descriptions and video autoplay. So you might have your mobile set up a certain way. You can use everything, and you kind of would expect that you can do the same on desktop. Another bunch of things that we just didn't look in a lot of detail, but certainly, need further thought. There's a lot of use of ARIA instead of HTML, so, role equals heading instead of an H1, ARIA label instead of label 4. Now, I know that a lot of accessibility specialists say that that's okay, but what we see in the real world is that this really trips up assistive technologies, and you really should not use ARIA if you can use HTML instead, because HTML has a standard way of behaving with assistive technologies. It has keyboard accessibility. It gets read out by default, by screen readers, etc., which ARIA just is not supported in that way yet. We also saw reCAPTCHA triggered on Facebook. I'm 100% sure that captures would be triggered on all social media networks if you operated them the wrong way, and I have yet to see a capture that's actually accessible, and WCAG 2 Working Group has actually put together a recent note about how captures are not accessible, and colour contrasts were also a serious problem, and it just happens year after year after year. Colour contrast is really bad across all the social media networks. So now I'm going to talk about the 5 steps to making social media accessible. So basically, step 1 is contact details. So make sure your contact information is available on your social media account page. And so your social media account page is different depending on what social media you're working on. And the information you should provide is your primary phone number, email address, and a link to your agency website. That's the absolute minimum that you need to provide. That way people can contact you if they can't get to the information on the network. The second rule is to repeat content. Not everyone uses just one social media. There'll be some social media that's more accessible than others to different groups. So make sure that your social media is available on your website, because none of the social media networks are accessible, so you need to have a source of truth, which is your website, the fully accessible version of the content that you're putting out. Consider providing daily or weekly or monthly digests of all the content that you output on social media, and you'd be surprised how many people sign up for that. Provide easy points of entry for more information. So, for example, if you have a competition that you're, win an iPad, if you, register for a course in a certain period of time, make sure that information is obvious on your website. Don't just bury it somewhere. It should be linked from your homepage or in your news section or something like that. It can't just be buried somewhere. And most important of all, post your social media to multiple social media networks. Some social media networks are better than others for different groups of people. So don't think, oh, well, I've tweeted it out, that's fine. You need to put it on Facebook and put it on Instagram, etc. And so don't have, oh, well, we're going to put a couple of these things on Instagram and a couple of different things on Facebook. They all have to have the same things. If you have 3 social media networks, then every single social media post that you have needs to go on all those 3 networks. And consider providing contact details for social media support or accessibility teams within your organisation. You could have like a social media help page on your site. Also, if you do that, provide links to the social media accessibility tips and support that are provided by the social media networks. They're not always easy to find, and people who, don't spend their entire life on computers won't necessarily be able to find this information. So if you just have a social media help page, make sure you provide links to, well, how do you add alternative text to Twitter, etc. And then also on that page, consider providing links to alternative apps and websites that create an accessible interface for social media. Clear and simple language, so use camel case. So that means basically capitalising the first letter of each word, makes it a lot easier to read. Avoid abbreviations where you can. Limit hashtags and add them only to the end. Avoid misspellings. And when you link to others' content on YouTube, warn users of autoplay, lack of transcripts, captions, audio descriptions. And step 5, consider actually testing and, actually contacting those social media networks. Maybe you'll have better luck than I do in terms of getting them to actually listen to, to accessibility requirements. So I'm going to jump into the specific tips to make Facebook accessible and various different social media networks, and then we'll finish with questions. So Facebook accessibility, you can add alternative text images, so make sure you do that. Link to transcripts of videos. It's better to load videos and add captions there and then post that video to Facebook rather than use the Facebook video feed. The link to accessibility tips is there if you need it. There are also alternative methods for the desktop interface. There's Facely HD on iOS, and m.facebook.com is more accessible than www.facebook.com. And there's an app called Metal on Android that's also more accessible. Instagram, add alternative text to all images because they've implemented that recently. Burn captions into your videos, so anyone who plays video will have captions there by default. Won't be accessible to screen reader users, but at least it will be there. And be careful of colour contrast if you're conveying information in your images. LinkedIn, add alternative text to your images. Ensure your profile has a clear image and that it's a photo of you, not like a dog or something, because people are reliant on that quite a lot in identifying people. It's better to search for contacts using Google rather than the LinkedIn search, and you should avoid using the LinkedIn mail system because it's not accessible. Pinterest. You should always identify your content as picture, video or audio, and once you save a pin, you can edit that pin and add a description there, and that will act as the alt text, and also burn captions into your videos. Twitter, make sure you use the alternative text description, use camel case, and there's a link to accessibility tips on Twitter. There's alternative methods for the desktop interface, Easy Chirp, which is on desktop, Twitterific on iOS, and Metal on Android. And last, YouTube, warn users of the autoplay. Make sure there's a transcript, captions and audio descriptions, and there are some links to using YouTube with a screen reader. There are alternative methods to the desktop, which basically you go to this, if you Google these three, you go to the page and put in a YouTube link. It will show you a accessible interface. So the first one's called the Accessible Interface to YouTube. The second is Accessible YouTube, and the third is Access YouTube. However, the most accessible thing you can do is actually post your videos to YouTube and then play them in an accessible player on your website. That way you can control the accessibility of the player. There are only two video players that don't have serious accessibility issues, OzPlayer, which is our video player, and AblePlayer by Terrell Thompson. Now, AblePlayer is free and it's available on GitHub, and it's also Creative Commons. You can contribute to it and things like that. OzPlayer is paid in some circumstances. And so, any questions so far?
Just a reminder, Ken.
Raf, if you
Go ahead, Jen.
sorry, go Kevin.
I was just going to say, just a reminder, you can unmute.
Raf, if you can unmute. I'm not going to say anything.
Okay. Just a reminder, those of you connected over the phone, pound or hash button 6 to unmute your line. Raf, if you are connected via audio, that will work for you as well. But if you are connected through voice over IP, let me know in the chat. I will have to enable your microphone manually. We did have a comment while Gian was speaking from Dennis. He posted the first rule of ARIA, which, as Gian summarized, is basically to use HTML instead of ARIA whenever possible. And then a comment from Udita, very helpful, especially for YouTube, and Melanie, great information. So back to you, Gian and Raf.
Yeah, so Raf, if you could unmute yourself. The question from Purnima was, which browser tested with NVDA? Was it Firefox or Chrome? And Raf, if you can't unmute yourself, if you send me a message, then I can answer. If you send me a signal or an email.
What's Raf's last name? I can unmute from our side.
Shalampowitz.
Got it.
Oh, Raf is typing. But just while that's sorting, Dennis, it is free for non-profits. OzPlayer is free for non-profits that have an annual revenue under $1 million. For non-profits that have an annual revenue over $1 million, it's half price.
All right, I did enable Raf's mic, so if you do have a headset or a microphone attached to your computer, you should have gotten a pop-up asking you to connect.
Raf, maybe you can respond via the chat. And while we're waiting for Raf, Laurie said, I'm sure this depends on the user and the assistive technology they rely on, but did you find that desktop versus mobile one experience was more accessible than the other? Absolutely. Mobile in general was more accessible than desktop. Probably because, and we didn't look at why, but probably because you have a smaller, screen size and there's kind of less that people can do, and so movement and all that additional information is kind of like content is kind of streamlined a lot more on mobile devices than on desktop. Raf says he did testing on Chrome, because of Firefox Quantum. Basically, Firefox Quantum does not work very well with screen readers. We wrote a blog, Raf wrote a blog post about that. It's on AccessibilityOz.com. So, yeah, we just stayed away from Firefox Quantum because it could have just been an issue with the browser. Dennis says EasyChirp is web-based, so it can be used on tablet, mobile, as well as desktop. Yes, that's true. And EasyChirp is amazing. It's been around for many years. It's by Dennis Lembre, and he does it out of the kindness of his heart, and it's been operating for many years. He actually built one of the first accessible HTML5 players when he was back at PayPal.
Had a few more comments coming in. Ornima says, that's good to know. Thank you, Raf. Gian, all great information. Thanks for sharing. We do have a few more minutes, so please keep your questions coming. Got a great resource in Gian here, so please feel free to pick her brain.
And I want to say thanks to Russ. He did the screen reader testing. It took him weeks. And 6 social media networks, and having to create 6 social media networks on, desktop and on iOS. It was a lot of work.
Okay, well, I don't see any more questions coming in, and I don't see anyone who has gone off of mute. So I think that does conclude our session today. Give you a few minutes back in your day. A huge thank you to Gian. This was a fantastic presentation. And a big thank you to Tiffany and the team at AI for their captioning today. We had a couple of little hiccups there at the beginning, but you guys, you worked it out quickly, so thank you for that. And then just a couple of bits of follow-up information. Oh, we did lose our captioning again. Okay. We do have a feedback survey, so we would love to hear from you. Your input is very important in terms of planning our upcoming webinar series. So please go ahead. You can actually select that link right here in Adobe Connect, or as always, we send it out in the follow-up email that will be coming out in the next day or so as well. So please, it only takes a minute or two. Fill that out. If you've attended other webinars, you can fill it out for those as well. The very first question is selecting which webinar you attended. So please do that and make your voice heard in selecting our upcoming webinars. As I mentioned at the beginning, this webinar is recorded, and like almost all of our webinars, gets added to the archive webinar library. That will go up within a few days, so keep an eye out for that. As attendees of the live webinar, you automatically get access to the archive, so that will be included in our follow-up email as well. But if you'd like to see what else we've done over the last few years, we have 50 plus titles in the library right now, so feel free to check that out. And again, you can select that from the link right here or visit our website, accessibilityassociation.org. We do still have our 2019 call for webinars open. We've got a couple of titles in the works, and I don't want to reveal any of that now, but I would say stay tuned for that. They are particularly relevant to what's going on in accessibility in 2019 and 2020, so stay tuned for announcements there. And if you have any ideas for something you would like to present or someone you know would like to present, you can select that link. It's the third link on this page, and we have an application form. And then finally, I'd just like to announce that on Thursday, May 23rd at 11 a.m., we will have a session on digital accessibility return on investment. If you attended some of our earlier webinars this year, we've had sort of a mini theme in our 2019 professional development series for the business case for accessibility. So we started off with building the business case, and then we've had a few other sessions that are relevant to especially smaller organizations and achieving accessibility, and this will be the next webinar in that series. So that does conclude today's webinar. Again, a huge thanks to Gian, and I hope to see everybody at the next webinar.
Thank you, everyone.